It's an honor to be here today, to be back in Kobe after many years. I was last here in October 2019 to celebrate the Hyogo University Disaster Research and Safety Science Program. I've been asked to speak about two things today: long-term recovery outcomes, but also Hurricane Katrina. I was a consultant on the recovery planning for the city of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And there's a whole complex story to that process of planning for the rebuilding of the city. But just to talk a little bit about the impacts of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, this was really the large urban disaster of modern times in the United States that was really only something we knew of in the United States from historical disasters like the Chicago fires or the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco. We had not, for many, many years, had a large urban disaster like what occurred in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. 80% of the city was flooded. 90% of the population was displaced. Some people have never come back. I'll speak a little bit more about that. But the population of about 500,000 today is only 380,000. So 83% of the population numbers today from what was there pre-Katrina, but many more people left and new people came. So there are actually more people who have been permanently displaced than just that 17%. The other important thing is the scale of the losses. We're $150 billion of loss in the state of Louisiana, much of which was in the city of New Orleans. Housing, infrastructure, the levee reconstruction for the flood protection for the city, roads, water, many things were damaged, public buildings, the business districts. So it was an enormous reconstruction effort. I'm also going to draw upon that case study, but also other case studies that are covered in a book that I wrote with my longtime research collaborator, Dr. Robert Olshansky. Together, we've looked at recovery, particularly as urban planners. We were interested for many years in studying the planning process, how communities actually plan for recovery, how prior city plans were helpful in guiding reconstruction after major disasters. But we decided to write this book really for mayors like Mayor Dalzell, governors, presidents, who are elected leaders who are going to face a large-scale reconstruction like New Orleans, like Kobe, like the Tohoku earthquakes, like Christchurch, New Zealand. So our work covers the 6 countries where we've spent the most time and several case studies within each of those countries. One of the first things we learned was actually something that we published research on after Hurricane Katrina and before we wrote our book. But it was a concept that we started thinking about with our research here in Kobe, actually, after the 1995 earthquakes. And really, as urban planners, we've been asking ourselves, how is urban development different after disasters than in normal times? And the concept we call it is actually time compression. That cities are always developing and redeveloping. You will be replacing roads, renewing water systems, pipes, new schools, buildings get torn down and redeveloped, neighborhoods get redeveloped over time. It's part of normal urban development and redevelopment. But what happens in a catastrophic disaster is so much of the capital, the buildings, the infrastructure, the services that communities provide are destroyed all at one time. So you have to do all of that urban redevelopment in a very short time period. What normally might have been a city built over 50 years now needs to be rebuilt in 5 years or 10 years. So time compression means that you have a focused amount of activities in time and space, but it also means you have to make lots of decisions. And you need lots of money in a much more focused time and space. And so the place of disaster becomes very different from other cities for that period of time. And at some point, you go back to actually it just being normal development. And that's that end point of recovery that's very hard to really describe. When are you recovering and when are you just going back to normal urban redevelopment and planning? So there's never really a very clear endpoint for disaster recovery. The other way that we framed our lessons were to talk about that across all these cases, developed countries and developing countries, we really found that the process of managing recovery has, there are 4 things that if managers of recovery can work with those 4 items, money, information, collaboration, and time, that will allow the process to move more smoothly, and in particular, reduce the uncertainty that disasters cause. Because of all of this unknown about rebuilding, it becomes very uncertain for people, it becomes very uncertain for the residents, and that uncertainty alone can actually kind of work against elected leaders who often are asked to leave office very soon after a disaster because of all of that uncertainty and that fear of the future, all the change that a community has to go through. So we encourage people to think of the framework for rebuilding in the context of working with money, information, collaboration, and time. So I'll just briefly summarize my recommendation or my lessons from Katrina around those comments. The first, as I mentioned, there was a lot of money required to rebuild New Orleans, even though the commitment of much money had already taken place 1 year after Katrina by the federal government in the United States to help with the rebuilding. We still identified a $14 billion gap in money that was still needed for the city to recover. And that actually just this past year in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act by the federal government, did a large portion of that money finally get allocated to repair roads and the water system and some of the other pieces of infrastructure in the city that were so heavily damaged by Katrina 16 years earlier. But what I want to point out here is one of the important lessons from Katrina was really that there was a resistance by the federal government to fund long-term recovery. One, because it hadn't been experienced at this scale in the United States, but secondly, also that the state of Louisiana and the city of New Orleans in particular had a poor record of governance. The government was not comfortable giving money to government officials who didn't have good records in managing money in the past. And money was never committed in one particular funding package, like has happened for Hurricane Sandy and some other disasters in the United States. It actually came through attachments onto other spending packages, like the Iraq War that was going on at the time. The funding for housing repair actually came in that through those other funding packages, including most recently in 2021. The second is that if you can't have a lot of money, you can easily also use information like money. Both are fuels for recovery. So for leaders to think about actually using information as a fuel to have all the actors, all the people impacted, the stakeholders in a community tip in and participate in the recovery. And so increasing those information flows is very important. And in Louisiana, the way they overcame sort of the lack of confidence in government, the lack of transparency and accountability, was to form a state recovery authority, the Louisiana Recovery Authority, that provided guidance for the recovery process. And that gave more confidence to the federal government and others to invest in Louisiana. Also, the New Orleans Data Center was created, which became a place to track not just the physical impacts of recovery and the recovery process, but also the social impacts. And there's a small graph right here just showing population today by race in New Orleans. And the part that you see on the left is that the Black population is not what it was before Katrina. And that's really the part of the source of truth, is that kind of data tracking who really was displaced by the disaster long term and in the city and elsewhere. Collaboration is very important because that is how you get all the stakeholders to tip in. And the lesson from New Orleans has been that we started a co-design planning process in New Orleans, modeled after the Machi Zuccotti planning process in Kobe, actually, working with neighborhoods, bringing communities together to plan their recovery together. And that actually has now become the standard for how planning is being done, or communities are asking for planning to be done in Louisiana, as they now look at a regional plan to deal with coastal subsidence, land loss, and climate change. In the Louisiana SAFE program is modeled after the planning process in New Orleans. Lastly, balancing time constraints. As I mentioned, we have time compression. And in this case, the idea of actually balancing time as a leader, recognizing that sometimes you need to take time to plan in order to move faster in recovery. That's very hard to tell leaders, that you actually need to slow down to speed up. And the other point we learned is really the more change, which is really important for Build Back Better. Build Back Better often means there will be lots of change. You may have to actually change the design of communities. You may have to relocate people. The more change, the more engagement you need to have with the community, the stakeholders in the planning process. So if you're just rebuilding like for like, it's okay to do small consultation. But if you're actually going to change the landscape, the urban design, where people live, you must engage them through collaborative empowerment processes. In my conclusions, I just want to say that we can be both fast and smart by do a better job of managing recovery if we think about money, information, collaboration, and time. Across all of our cases, rebuilding was done to a higher standard. So we never found a place where Build Back Better wasn't there. It just is to what degree. And lastly, it's important to think about, when we look at outcomes, that too often our programs are focused on the asset aspects of outcomes, the quantity of things being built, the cost, the standards for construction, the time. But we really must, for good recovery, focus on the people aspects and outcomes: equity, well-being, accessibility, the design. Do people like where they're going to live? And the satisfaction. These are things we have to track as well. And some places have done a really good job of that, including Christchurch, and they're coming up next to explain their story. And that is my conclusions. Domo arigato gozaimasu.